and when I bent down to see if he was still breathing, he opened his eyes. For a moment, something there stared at me, something that knew me, and then he whispered, low, hoarse. He used the nickname my mother used to give me when she hid me behind the china cabinet. Little Dove. No one else knew that. No one. But he knew. And he told me where the note was hidden. My name is Iris Lorraine Beck. I have 84 years, and today I live alone with my dog, Dutch, in a wooden house in Portland, Oregon. I often sit here, in this rocking chair, in front of the window that looks out at the ever-gray sky. Sometimes time stands still, and other times I'm the one standing still. On the shelf next to me sits a miniature boat my father gave me before he set sail. He never returned, and maybe that's why I went. I went after him. I went to war. But what I found there was something else. Today I decided to record this story, not out of courage, nor vanity. It's because this silence has begun to weigh more heavily than the secret itself. Because I no longer dream of bombs. I dream of eyes. Eyes that call to me in a way no one else ever did. And sometimes I still hear that voice, hoarse, wounded, telling me things I should have forgotten. But I haven't. It's not easy to remember, but it's harder to hide. So if you're there, on the other side, listening to this true story of this grandmother, tell me where you're listening from. Only then will I know how far my secret has traveled. I went to war because of a name. My brother Daniel's. He was 19 when he disappeared in the Pacific. My father died without an answer. My mother's eyes were dry from waiting so long. And I was the only one still moving in that house, with emptiness in my heels. When 2 years had passed without news of him, I volunteered for the Navy. They said they were sending me to Guam. I couldn't even aim on a map, but I didn't back down. It was 1944, and everything hurt. The island felt like an open wound in the middle of the ocean. The heat was a constant punishment, and the smell of the sea mingled with that of metal, iodine, and damp clothing. Our base was in a rehabilitation zone, somewhat removed from direct combat. But the war arrived nonetheless, carried in broken bodies, lost eyes, and hands that trembled for no reason. We woke to the sound of helicopters, slept when we could. And between one bandage and the next, we learned to swallow our own tears. I was young. Her brown hair was pinned back, her hands too thin to hold so much pain. My naval uniform never looked clean enough and my feet were always soaked. Even so, the boys called me Blue Angel because of the faded ribbon I tied around my wrist. It was a childhood memory, a scrap of cloth from the blanket my mother used to cradle me. I called it my talisman. But I was just nostalgic. The list of wounded never stopped. Men arrived every day, named, nameless, guilty, legless, with love letters in their pockets, or with their eyes fixed on the afterlife. The list told us who we should treat, and who we should let go. But sometimes someone not on the list would show up, and that's when the silence began. His silence was the loudest of all. I was almost falling asleep when I heard hurried footsteps in the wooden hallway. The rhythmic sound of boots shook me from my stupor, and moments later there was a knock on my door. The night was stuffy, and the ceiling fan spun idly, spreading the salty smell of the sea mixed with old disinfectant. I got up with some resistance, already accustomed to emergency calls. But there was something different about that knock, something that wasn't a medical emergency. It was a secret. I donned my lab coat and was led to Tent 2. The air inside seemed thicker, as if holding its breath. There was a gurney alone at the back of the infirmary. On it lay a body, still breathing. His face was disfigured with bruises, covered in loosely secured gauze. No uniform, No boots, no name tag. Nothing to link him to any army or platoon. He wasn't part of any record. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere. One of the doctors, who rarely showed any emotion, was pale. He gave me a hard, almost pleading look, as if passing a burden. I sensed immediately that this case was unofficial. It shouldn't exist. There was the risk of silence, of unwritten orders, of the danger of helping. I approached. I was used to broken bodies, but there was something about him that made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way his chest rose and fell with effort, or the way his fingers curled with each breath. Even unconscious, he seemed to react to my presence. I placed the stethoscope on his chest. The heartbeat was faint, irregular, but it was there. I leaned in to examine his pupils, and then he opened his eyes. It was a second, a stare, a silence so intense it made my stomach turn. Those eyes recognized me. I felt it. And then, through wounded lips, he whispered a single word. A word I hadn't heard since childhood. A name too intimate to be there, on that battlefield. A nickname only my mother used, and one I hadn't heard since before her death. At that moment, everything inside me broke. The stretcher belonged to a stranger, but the voice came from a past I never imagined I'd encounter again. I spent the entire night beside that stretcher, but he said nothing more. He just breathed heavily, his eyes closed, his body numb, as if fighting something that wasn't just happening inside, but somewhere between what we see and what we feel. The other wounded called out for their mother, for home, for God. But he called out for no one. He was just there, like a presence out of place, out of time, as if he were there by mistake, or as punishment. I searched for a file. Nothing. I looked through the papers from the last medical patrol. No matching description. Not even a generic entry for unknown male. The lists were complete, up to date. He simply wasn't in the records. And that was worse than any injury. A bruised body we care for. A body without a name we fear. The sheets covering his legs were covered in mud, but it wasn't island mud. The earth tone was lighter, like the countryside. I also noticed a faint scent of aged lavender, something common in long-stored clothing, or on the hands of old ladies who used antique soaps. And it didn't make any sense. He didn't look like a recent combatant, nor like a lost local. It was as if he'd traveled through time to fall there. The strangest thing was the complete absence of any markings on his body. No identifying tattoos, no dried blood under his fingernails, no handcuff marks. Nothing to indicate where he came from or what he'd done. Just a deep wound on his head, as if he'd been hit hard and forgotten. As if someone wanted him to forget. And they had. I began treating him with what I had. I cleaned his wounds. I checked his fever. I kept monitoring him. I did what was right. But inside something ached. It was like tending to a cloudy mirror. I saw something that belonged to me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. His face, even disfigured, seemed vaguely familiar. Or maybe it was the traces of silence I recognized, the same ones I'd carried with me for decades. None of the doctors returned to see him that night. The other nurses pretended not to notice his presence. And the next day, when I asked the officer in charge about his transfer to the larger base, I received only a hard, non-committal look. He was invisible. And now, he was mine. On the third night, he truly woke. Not completely, but in a strange way, as if consciousness was slowly returning, not through his mind, but through his senses. First his eyes, which began to follow my movements. Then his fingers, which twitched slightly when I touched his hand. Finally, his breathing, which began to change rhythm, whenever I spoke near him. I didn't say much, just clinical instructions, routine words. But he responded. Not to all of them, only to the ones that carried echoes. That morning the generator went out for a few hours. The tent was left with only the blue glow of the dim flashlight and the constant sound of the waves crashing in the distance. The island seemed whole inside that canvas room. I sat beside the stretcher and began writing my report, as I did every night. But suddenly, he moved his head, slowly, and murmured something, so softly I thought I'd imagined it. I closed the notebook. I walked closer. He repeated, more clearly. And that was when the world stopped. He spoke of my childhood closet, the one with the double doors and a false bottom, where I hid my drawings, my angry notes, and a torn letter I wrote at age 8, the last time I heard my parents fight. He described the blue lining inside the closet, and even the mark of the candle that had fallen and stained the wood. No one else knew about it, not my sister, not my husband, not even myself, because they were memories so old I no longer knew where they began or ended. But he knew. I remember pressing my hand to my chest, as if searching for air. Everything inside me trembled. There was no explanation. He couldn't know. And yet, he knew, with details that cut me like a slow blade. He went back to sleep, as if nothing had happened. I sat there until daybreak. The sun rose slowly, bathing the canvas in a dull light. And for the first time since arriving at war, I was afraid to look inside myself. In that moment, I understood. The wounded man wasn't just a survivor. He was a portal. A hole in time that had opened to bleed out everything I'd hidden for years. And now, it was all there, wide open, whispered, impossible. The next morning, I couldn't go straight to the infirmary. First, I needed to regroup, or try. I walked to my tent, took a deep breath, and washed my face 3 times. But the face reflected in the mirror didn't look like mine. It was younger than I felt, but the eyes were too old for the skin surrounding them. I picked up the blue brooch I always wore pinned to my uniform. It was a memento from my mother, a fabric flower she'd sewn herself, with uneven edges and a small button in the center. I'd never opened that brooch. I'd never thought there was anything inside. But there, in that moment, the memory of the locker and his words hammered like a drum inside my chest. I ran to the small trunk where I'd kept my things since arriving in Guam. At the bottom, among folded papers and yellowed photographs, was the childhood notebook I'd taken with me almost without thinking. A habit, or a lucky charm. I opened it with trembling hands. Some pages were loose, others stuck together by time. I ran my fingers over a page with wax marks. The candle mark. It was there. I closed my eyes and saw myself kneeling in front of the closet, 8 years old, writing on a crumpled piece of paper. I don't want to hear them scream anymore. It was a sentence I'd never said out loud, a pain I'd never named. But he'd said it, in the same words. In the infirmary, the wounded man was asleep again, his face still swollen but less pale. His breathing was more steady. He didn't seem so lost anymore. Or maybe I was starting to lose myself with him. As he was dressing me, I noticed his skin bore old scars, but none were visible where the blow had struck him. It was as if someone had erased the very part of his memory where names reside, leaving only what should never have been said. He talked about me, but without knowing who I was. And that hurt more than any accusation. He carried something inside him that I'd never told anyone. And by whispering it, he made me revisit parts of my life that I'd buried so deeply I couldn't tell if they were memories or inventions. But now, it didn't matter, because his silence spoke my language. On the 4th day, I received a formal summons. One of the communications officers handed me a folded note, stamped with urgency. We were rarely called in for direct conversations with the leadership, much less with the unit captain. Even less so in writing. I walked to the command room with my legs stiff and my chest heaving. There were no names on the paper, just a timetable and a penciled arrow. Once there, I found Captain Winslow, a dry, measured man known for following rules like a god. He stood before the base map, arms crossed, not looking at me. When he spoke, his voice sounded like a razor. He said there had been a mistake, that the man interned in Tent 2 shouldn't have been there, that he wasn't part of any mission, no list, no authorized transport, that there was no rescue underway in that area, no team had been sent, no missing soldier matched his description. He was a ghost. And ghosts, he said, shouldn't be given shelter. Then, with the calm of someone who's been giving orders for too long, he stated that if I insisted on continuing the treatment, it could be considered a breach of protocol. He said the risk was high, that there were suspicions of espionage and infiltration, that people like that man don't just appear out of nowhere, and that sometimes helping someone can be more dangerous than letting them die. As he spoke, I felt an old feeling return, something between guilt and anger, like when I heard my parents arguing behind the door. The same silent helplessness, the same pain of not knowing whose side to take. I just nodded. I agreed. I did what they expected. But inside my lab coat pocket, my hand clutched the blue brooch tightly, and for the first time I noticed it had opened slightly, as if something were trying to get out. I returned to the ward without saying anything to the other nurses. None of them dared ask. They knew what was meant when it came to silence. The man was still unconscious, but his body seemed less tense. The fever had gone down. The wounds were cleaner. And as I changed the sheets, I noticed a stain on the fabric. Not blood, not pus, not dirt. It was something more subtle. A familiar scent wafted from it, like aged lavender. The same scent as the ribbon my mother kept in the secret closet. That night I had a strange dream. I was walking through a white field, and the ground was bursting with pieces of letters I thought had burned. I woke with my heart racing and the certainty that I wouldn't be able to obey the order I'd received. I had already chosen, even without understanding, even with fear. The next morning, as I was changing the sheets on his stretcher, something made me stop. It wasn't the dried blood in the folds of the fabric. That was already part of the routine. It was the smell. A drowsy, almost imperceptible aroma that rose from the white cotton, as if it had been sewn there decades ago. Lavender. But not the usual lavender found in soaps. It was different. A sweeter, older one. The same one my mother used to scent the bottom of the drawers. The same one I smelled when I opened the closet hidden behind the blue curtain in our bedroom, on days when it rained heavily. Instantly, my eyes filled with tears, and without thinking, I pressed my face against the stained sheet, trying to decipher whether it was memory or madness. The scent pulled me back in time so forcefully that my legs weakened. I felt the ground tilt, the world shrink. It was as if it carried within it the echo of everything I'd once tried to forget. It wasn't just the scent. It was the texture of the fabric, the way it had been folded, the crescent-shaped stain. Everything harking back to the night. I burned the goodbye note I never sent. I remembered the letter, the spilled candle wax, the purple stain on the cabinet lining, right above the secret shelf. The image was so clear that for a moment I saw myself as a girl again, my hands stained with paint and my eyes red from holding back tears. I returned to the present with a tremor in my back. The wounded man was still asleep, but his face seemed more serene, as if, even unconscious, he knew something was being returned to its rightful place. And then I realized, this man wasn't telling me things with words. He was awakening memories with his presence. It was as if his body exuded a past that belonged to me, a past I had locked away in internal drawers for safekeeping, but which was now escaping through the cracks. I quietly tucked the folded sheet away. I didn't have the heart to send it to the base laundry. I hid it under my bed, inside a cloth bag, like someone guarding a crime clue, or a secret too precious to explain. That day I understood there was something between us that no logic could translate, something that smelled of childhood but hurt like loss, and that maybe, just maybe, was there to be seen, before it was too late. During the afternoon shift, I sat in the empty ward to write the day's report. My fingers gripped the pen, but nothing would move to the paper. Every time I tried to write down patient, unidentified, stable condition, something inside me froze. Because he was more than an absent number. He was an opaque mirror, an old weight that now begged to be read again. I looked at him. He was breathing evenly. His eyes were still closed. His arms were loose at his sides, as if he had finally surrendered to existence. That's when he began to speak. Not clearly, but in a drawn-out murmur, as if in a trance. And what he said wasn't just a sound. It was an echo. Loose words, broken sentences, but familiar, very familiar. For a few seconds I didn't recognize it. And then, like someone finding a portrait underwater, I recognized every piece. He repeated passages from the letter I wrote when I was 8. The letter I left in the hidden closet. The same one I tore to shreds after hearing my parents fight so loudly the window shook. The letter I began with, "If you don't see me, I'll disappear." He said that, in the same order, with the same pause between sentences, including the final part, the one I scribbled angrily. "I don't want to hear you screaming like I don't exist anymore." At that moment, I dropped the pen. I stood up slowly, as if my body wasn't my own. I approached the stretcher, unsure if he was speaking to me, or for me. He repeated the last line, already almost asleep again. And then, silence. I stood there, unable to cry, because it was too big, too painful. That letter was burned in the backyard, secretly, under an old coffee can. I remember the smell of the smoke, the fear that someone would see it. I never spoke about it to anyone. Not my sister. Not God. But now, she was returning through the mouth of a stranger. Or maybe, not so stranger. The sheet I'd hidden under my bed felt heavier that night, and my blue brooch, now slightly cracked on the side, seemed to throb against the fabric of my lab coat, as if it wanted to burst open, as if the secret was finally ready to come out. That night, sleep wouldn't come. And when it didn't stay. I'd wake with the sensation of hearing something. A creak of wood, a muffled footstep outside the tarp, the hum of a muffled voice. At first, I thought it was just my body reacting to the exhaustion, the fear, the absurdity of it all. But the sensation persisted. It grew. It crept in like an invisible infiltration. The next shift, I noticed the others were different. The younger nurses started looking at me strangely, not with overt suspicion, but with a subtle hesitation in their eyes, as if they were measuring something they didn't understand. One of them, who had previously smiled when I met her in the cafeteria, turned away as I passed. Another dropped an IV bottle near my stretcher, and didn't apologize. In the corridor outside, I began to notice unusual movements. Officers who weren't from our ward walked slowly, as if they were, by chance, passing by. One of them stopped at the ward door, peered inside with a poorly disguised look, and walked on without saying a word. In the supply room, I found the files shuffled, something that never happened. And on the admissions board, someone had erased the last patient's entry, even though they hadn't officially done so. It was as if someone was trying to clean up a mess. And I asked myself, whose mistake? During the night shift, I kept the lights off. I sat near his stretcher with the flashlight off, just listening. The sound of his breathing remained steady, but there was something else, an outside noise, as if someone were moving around the back of the tent, paused, tense. It wasn't an animal. It was human. But he didn't come any closer. Not that day. I stood there, motionless, feeling the sweat trickle beneath my uniform. My hand rested on the brooch. The brooch felt more fragile now, as if some small crack had opened completely. A piece of the edge had come away, revealing a hollow space inside. And for a second I considered ripping it open completely. But something held me back. It wasn't time yet. At dawn, when everything seemed to calm down, I lay back down in the hammock at the lodge. But I didn't close my eyes, because for the first time the fear wasn't about what might happen to him, but about what might happen to me if I insisted on protecting him. And yet, I already knew there was no going back. I had welcomed him, and now it was as if his silence was beginning to expose mine. The next day, amid the stuffy corridors of the infirmary, something changed. The air seemed thicker, not just from the heat or the smell of alcohol and gauze, but from an uneasiness that wouldn't dissipate. With every step I took, I felt the eyes of others roaming my back, even though they tried to hide it. And among all those avoided glances, one pierced me differently. It was while changing the bandages of the patient in bed 3. As I washed my hands at the iron sink, I caught sight of Ruth, the youngest nurse on our shift, in the mirror. Her eyes watched me with something between hesitation and compassion. It wasn't accusation, nor contempt. It was as if she recognized what was happening and remembered something she'd also tried to forget. He didn't say a word. He just looked away when he noticed me. But at the end of the shift, when I returned to my tent to put away the day's notes, I found a small object on my pillow, a rose made of white gauze, perfectly folded. A gesture too symbolic to be casual. No one would leave something like that by chance, and no one but the nurses would have access to it. I picked up the rose carefully. It smelled of ether and silence. And inside the central fold, a strand of blue thread was discreetly tied. The same shade of the ribbon I wore on my wrist, the same shade of the brooch my mother had sewn, the same blue as the letter paper I'd burned as a child. There was no note, no signature, just the gesture. I tucked the rose into one of the inside pockets of my lab coat, like someone receiving a secret message. And for the first time since it all began, I felt that maybe I wasn't so alone in this choice. Maybe someone knew. Maybe someone had also welcomed a wounded person off the list, a survivor who shouldn't exist. But that wasn't relief. It was closer to dread. Because if anyone knew, someone could also report it. That late afternoon, the light in the tent fell slanted, casting long shadows across the ground. The man was still asleep, but his expression had changed, as if he'd dreamed something, and wept in the dark. And when I looked at him, I no longer knew if I was protecting a stranger, or being guided by him into myself. His body began to respond better to the treatment. His fever subsided, his wounds healed with unusual speed, and his once dull eyes now shone with more presence. It was as if he were returning. But returning from where? On the morning of the 10th day, I entered the ward and found the wounded man sitting alone, his back arched, his gaze fixed on the wooden floor. A junior nurse was helping him drink water, but he wouldn't answer any questions. He was conscious, but empty. Neither yes nor no. Neither pain nor relief. A blank man, like a page torn from a forgotten book. I tried to talk to him. I called him generically, with soft words. He looked at me with a certain curiosity, but there was no recognition, no fear. Just a vague distrust, as if I were a shadow passing by. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched. Not in pain, but as if he didn't know what a gesture of care was. That broke something inside me. I decided to let him rest. I turned off the tent lights, closed the side canvas, and left for a few minutes. When I returned, I found an impossible scene. He was standing barefoot, leaning against the corner of the room. His feet were shaking. His eyes fixed on an unlit blue candle I used to keep on top of the supply closet, a personal memento used to pray quietly in quiet moments. It was a candle with no official function. No one on the staff paid it any attention. But he looked at it as if it were a relic. And then he whispered, "That's where you hid it." The voice came out slow, hoarse, and the sentence seemed to come from somewhere other than the present. It wasn't a question, not a delusion. It was a statement. He knew. Even without knowing who it was, he knew me. There, standing in that room, holding an empty tray. I understood that his mind might have erased names, dates, and identities, but not what truly mattered. Not the symbol, not the gesture, not the vivid memory of the blue candle which I had hidden in the closet as a child, along with the fragments of the letter I swore I would never let anyone read. He forgot everything, except what I never told. The same night he murmured about the blue candle, I was overcome by a restlessness I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a kind of hunger for confirmation, as if everything I was experiencing needed tangible, concrete proof, something that would tell me, yes, this is really happening. I returned to my tent in silence. The sky was heavy, covered in motionless clouds, and the sound of the sea sounded deeper than usual. Inside the trunk where I kept my belongings, I began rummaging through everything with hurried hands. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. A small diary, covered in gray cloth, stained with age. It was the kind of thing we take on impulse, without knowing why. I'd brought it from home when I embarked for Guam, more out of superstition than necessity. And honestly, I thought I'd lost it. I sat on the bed with it on my lap and started flipping through it. The first few pages were filled with banal childhood notes, flower names, drafts of letters to imaginary friends, poorly drawn pictures. But as I turned more pages, I saw something was wrong. Some were torn out, others crossed out. Entire passages had been forcefully erased, as if I'd tried to erase my own voice. And then I found, right in the center of the notebook, a sentence that made my stomach turn. "If you don't see me, I'll disappear." The same phrase he whispered 2 days before, with his eyes closed and the voice of my childhood on his lips. I continued flipping through the pages. There was a page stuck to it. I tried to gently pry it free. Inside, written in my childish handwriting, was another forgotten passage. "I don't want to hear you screaming like I don't exist anymore." My chest tightened. This was no coincidence, nor imagination. It was real, written by me, decades before. And now, returned by a man with no name, no defined face, no known past. As if he had been created from this diary, as if he existed only to remind me of what I buried. I closed the notebook slowly. The silence of the tent seemed to hear my thoughts. I wanted to burn the diary right there, as I had done with the original letter. But I couldn't. There was something sacred in that discovery, something that no longer belonged to me alone. I put the notebook under my pillow and sat there for hours, staring at the dark sky through the cracks in the canvas. I understood then that he wasn't just talking about my past. He was the past that came back to finish saying what I refused to hear. It was dawn when I awoke to something that wasn't the usual sound of the base. It wasn't helicopters. It wasn't the generator engine. It wasn't the creaking of wood beneath the night nurse's feet. It was a melody, fragile, tremulous, as if sung by someone about to forget their own voice. I stood up slowly, feeling the cold of the floor against my bare heels. The air was still. The wind didn't blow, and yet the tent canvas swayed slightly, as if rocked by invisible hands. I walked to the exit and carefully pulled back the curtain. Outside, the sky opened into opaque clouds, and the sea, always distant in its dark vastness, seemed closer than ever. And the singing continued, low, repetitive. My feet followed the sound instinctively, without me deciding. When I reached the side of the ward, I realized there was no one there, no sentry, no patient out of place, just the night and the singing, an ancient, soft lament, almost a prayer. That's when I recognized the melody. It was the lullaby my mother made up when I was little. I never heard it anywhere but our room. It was never written down. It was never recorded. It was ours alone. She used to sing to me on stormy days, one hand on my chest, and the other holding the blue brooch. The lyrics were simple, without perfect rhyme, without a definite ending. But there was one part, the one about the sea that carries, the sea that brings, that lulled me to sleep without fear. That night, on the lost island of the Pacific, I heard this part, whole, in the same intonation, as if my mother was calling me back. I felt the tears fall effortlessly. I didn't cry. I just let them flow. The melody gradually disappeared, like mist. When I returned to the infirmary, he was awake. He looked at me with a serenity I hadn't seen before. Not a word was spoken, only silence. The same that comes after an ancient truth is finally heard. And for the first time I understood that there was something beyond memory in that connection. Something that escaped the flesh, logic, time. Something that perhaps he himself didn't even know how to name. But for some impossible reason I sang with my mother's voice. It was a muggy morning when the envelope arrived. The paper was thick, with a red stamp and a military seal. One of the guys from the administrative wing handed it to me without saying anything. Just a fleeting glance, as if he knew what was inside but preferred not to comment. I opened it carefully. 2 pages, short and to the point. The unidentified man was to be transferred to a high-security facility on another island, under the supervision of senior officers. No explanation, no medical justification. Just the final sentence, which I can still hear today. Instructed to cooperate. No objections. The contents didn't surprise me. I was expecting it. What surprised me was the urgency. They were in a hurry. They wanted to get him out of there before anyone else realized what he was carrying, or what he revealed simply by existing. I spent the rest of the day in silence, caring for him as I had always done, but with the weight of the watch on my shoulders. He, for his part, seemed calm. There was no fever, no tremors. He stared through the opening in the tarp as if waiting for something, or as if he already knew this was the end. When the 2 men arrived in dark uniforms and armed to the teeth, I was sitting beside his bed. I stood slowly, as if saying goodbye to a relative in a coma. They lifted him carefully, placing him on a reinforced stretcher with straps. There were no words between us. He didn't protest. He didn't cry. He just looked at me, with the same eyes as the first night, full of an absence that knew too much. As they stepped over the threshold, something fell from the edge of the stretcher. A button. Navy blue. Old. From a civilian coat. Bending down to pick it up, I noticed the detail. It was sewn with white thread, and on the inside, there was something embroidered that stopped me in my tracks. 2 letters. MB, my mother's initials. Not mine, not his. Hers. The button was slightly worn, with a crack in the center. It was identical to the one missing from one of the pockets of the coat she wore on cold mornings while making fennel tea in the kitchen. A coat I donated after her death, and which I never saw again. I closed my hand over the object and said nothing. The soldiers left with it without another word. The canvas swayed slowly after they passed, and I stood there, alone, with that blue button in my hand, like someone holding what was left of an interrupted dream. It took me 2 days to open the brooch. It sat there, on the table beside my bed, like a small, contained explosion, an artifact from another time waiting to be activated. The blue button with my mother's initials rested beside it, still warmed by all that it meant, and all that could not be explained. It was the same brooch she wore on her winter coat, the same one that passed to me as a silent inheritance, without conversation, without ceremony, simply handed to me in a brown paper envelope, shortly after her death. I never knew why she gave it to me. Just that. I never suspected it was more than a hand-sewn ornament, too fragile to be valuable. But now, it weighed like lead. The next morning I waited for the infirmary to fall asleep. The entire island seemed suspended in time. I took the brooch between my fingers, examining it carefully. Through the already visibly cracked side, I inserted a thin pair of tweezers, the kind we use to extract shrapnel. A soft crack. The fabric gave way. The aged metal structure creaked, and then the hidden space revealed its secret. Folded in 4, wrapped in faded blue stitching, was a tiny, nearly transparent piece of paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. The ink was faded but legible. It was my mother's handwriting. Definitely. Round, firm, sad. It was written there. If she ever forgets it, return it carefully. Nothing more. No signature. No date. No explanation. The message was too short for a regular note, too intimate for a forgotten note, and too direct to have been written by accident. She. Not you. Not my daughter, but she. As if it were addressed to someone who would come later. I carefully folded the paper and placed it back inside the brooch. I closed it slowly, like someone replacing a stone on a grave. And in that instant, I understood that my mother knew. Not exactly what would happen, but she knew that something would slip away from me, that someday I would lose who I was. And I also knew, with the same cold certainty, that the man hadn't appeared there by chance. He had been sent. By whom? Why? I don't know. But he gave me back something that not even my own memory dared to touch anymore. In the palm of my hand between the button and the brooch, I now held more than objects. He held what was left of the impossible. And it was real. Time passed. The war ended. I returned home empty-handed and my chest full of locked compartments. I never heard from him again. No letters, no news, no clues. Just silence. A silence denser than any explosion I'd ever witnessed. I built a life based on this silence. I got married. I had a daughter. I worked. I cooked. I loved as best I could. I never told anyone. Not even him. My husband, who had his feet firmly on the ground and would never believe anything that didn't fit within palpable logic. On the outside, I was just a serene-looking woman who had served as a nurse in Guam. On the inside, I carried a blue button, a brooch sewn by my mother, and a hole in the time that no one else could see. Decades later, when my daughter was helping empty the attic of our old house, we found a box that wasn't mine. At least, not that I remembered. Light wood, with no lock. Inside were letters with no return address, neatly folded pieces of fabric, and a series of old photos, all small, sepia-toned, as if they had belonged to another family. While my daughter cleaned up the rest of the mess, I was left alone with the box. And then I found it. A thumbnail photo. On the back, scribbled in pencil, is my full name. In the image, a girl sat on a blue blanket with a man in the background, slightly out of focus. He was standing to the side. But, even with time eroding the details, I recognized the contours of his face, the tilt of his chin, the shadows under his eyes. It was him. Young, strong, alive, like I've never seen him. The image seemed too old to have been taken during the war, but new enough to coincide with the childhood I'd tried to forget. How could I? How could he be there? I remained motionless for long minutes. The reality around me began to waver, like a wet painting. What I remembered, was it still true? Or had everything been rearranged, as if he had always been there, just waiting to be seen? I held the photo carefully. I placed it inside the brooch, next to my mother's note, and I closed it. At that moment, I understood. Some missing people don't disappear. They just change places inside us. And sometimes, they come back, carrying what we let slip away. Today, I'm here, sitting in the same rocking chair, the blue brooch resting on my lap. Dutch sleeps at my feet. Another Dutch, older, slower, but with the same eyes that have followed me since Guam. The blue curtains dance in the light wind, and outside the gray sky seems to listen to me. The miniature boat on the shelf creaks discreetly, as if it, too, wants to tell a story. Since that photo, I haven't found any more clues. No confirmation, no explanation that would settle the questions. But maybe it's not meant to settle them. Today, when I opened my dresser drawer, I found a yellowed envelope glued to the wood. It wasn't there yesterday. I swear it wasn't. Inside was a piece of light blue fabric, the same blanket as in the photo, and an old, undated newspaper clipping that read, "Unidentified survivor transferred from Guam without official records." The clipping was folded, but on the back, there was a note, handwritten, in the same handwriting as the note on the brooch. She already remembers. That's when everything inside me went silent. Time no longer matters. Fear, too. Because now I know that what I experienced doesn't need to be understood to be true. Not even explained to be real. That man, wounded, forgotten, nameless, did not appear in my life by chance. He was the living reflection of what my soul did not have the courage to face alone. He knew my secret, because somehow he was part of it. And maybe it still does. I pick up the brooch again. I feel the cold metal warm in my palm. The blue button is tucked inside, along with the miniature photo and the old note. 3 pieces of a puzzle that no longer needs to be put together. Just felt. He was threatened, I know. And I, warned to let him go. But still I stayed. And he whispered my secret like someone returning something stolen by time. I was threatened if I helped him. But he whispered my secret. And now he belongs to me. Or maybe I belong to him. The war took a lot from me. But he gave me back a part I didn't even know was missing. If this story touched you, comment where you're listening to me from, and tell me, what would you have done?